The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I often talk about how I perceive the value of spending on space exploration to be significantly higher than the value many times of spending so much as a country on war, on defense, on the military-industrial complex. And to illustrate this, we now have an interesting story which points out that the first stealth jet attack on Syria last week cost more than the recent Indian mission to Mars, which was successful. Fears of a potent Syrian air defense system drove the Air Force in the U.S. to send its Silver Bullet force of F-22 Raptor stealth fighters into battle for the first time. The Pentagon confirmed that the $150 million jets had struck an ISIS command and control facility in Syria with a satellite-guided bomb. The Raptor's first mission was not cheap. Together, the missiles and the airstrikes cost at least $79 million to pull off, according to the Daily Beast. That's more expensive than India's mission to Mars, which was completed earlier this week, at a cost of just $74 million. This was a first for India. The country placed a satellite into orbit around Mars on its first attempt. Well, my response, Lewis, is yeah, but can that Indian craft fire Hellfire missiles at people?
I would say that it probably cannot, unfortunately.
And can it take pictures and send them back of us blowing stuff up on Mars?
No, but we can see pictures of a nice, peaceful planet.
Right. Yeah. So this further just reinforces the fact that so many Americans are disconnected from the reality of how much is being spent and how expensive it is to carry these things out. And very often our conversation only focuses on the moral and the strategic and the political, and not so much on the fiscal. And the fiscal is not something to be ignored, is it?
No, I think that is hugely important. I mean, we're spending billions, trillions and trillions of dollars on this nonsense over the years. Think about what that could have done for our country, for our infrastructure, for our people.
Particularly, Lewis, when you think about how often we spend the money first to give aid to a country and arm rebels or whatever, and then we end up spending more money to fight against those weapons we provided.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. But I think that the fiscal issue should be the number one thing talked about when it comes to this stuff.
Connor Friersdorf wrote an interesting article in The Atlantic where he says, do you believe that the NFL should suspend or ban any player who's caught assaulting a wife or girlfriend? And going on to say that he believes the focus on NFL domestic violence is actually misplaced. He says there's another American profession that has a significantly more alarming problem when it comes to domestic abuse. Many studies have found that the romantic partners of police officers suffer domestic abuse rates that are significantly higher than the general population at large. And while, of course, all partner abuse is unacceptable, as Connor writes, it's particularly problematic when the domestic abusers are the same individuals that are called by women when they are being abused in their homes. And then Connor Friersdorf goes on to argue, if there's any job that domestic abuse should disqualify a person from holding, isn't it the one job that gives you a lethal weapon, trains you to stalk people without their noticing, and relies on your judgment and discretion to protect the abused against domestic abusers? What's your reaction to this, Lewis? Do you believe that this is a bigger issue? What do you think about the fact that not that much media attention is paid to the higher rate of domestic abuse that we see from police officers? Is it because NFL players are more or less celebrities? They're individually in the public eye? What do you make of it?
If you take the general population as a whole and compare it to the players in the NFL, the NFL has a lower percentage of domestic violence. I mean,
correct.
Yeah. So, of course, it's the celebrity factor. It's the TV factor. Nobody cares if, a police officer from Wyoming beats up his wife. They only care if an NFL superstar who's on their fantasy team, who's making millions of dollars, isn't on TV all the time.
And what's sad about that is that you're very unlikely to ever have to call the NFL player if you're being beaten by your significant other. The police officer is actually the one who would show up in that event. So we really should care much more about that. And if we look at some of the numbers, Lewis, as the National Center for Women in Policing noted, 2 studies have found that at least 40% of police officer families experience domestic violence, in contrast to 10% of families in general. And a 3rd study of older and more experienced officers found a rate of 24%, which still would be 2 to 4 times higher in terms of the prevalence of domestic abuse within police officer families than outside of it. This is definitely a concern, and it's also an interesting thing to analyze in terms of the disparity in coverage when we look at the reaction to these NFL cases. And I think you're right, Lewis. It is a celebrity-like element. Even though not all NFL players are celebrities, the idea of being a professional football player is certainly seen in a very different light than that of being a police officer. And we really should be taking very seriously the issue that domestic abuse within police officer families is many times higher than that of the general population.
Yeah, let's ask ourselves why NFL players are under far more scrutiny than all of these people walking around carrying guns.
We also should think about the fact that if we talk about incarceration as a punishment for domestic violence, I'm not arguing that violence and crimes should go unpunished. But what I will say is something that's abundantly clear, which is if you have someone who has violent tendencies already against people that are in their own family, in their own home, incarcerating them and putting them in a situation that we know to be completely unproductive when it comes to furthering the ability to socialize, and we know that incarceration can actually create violent tendencies in those who went in for nonviolent offenses. I don't think that the incarceration system status quo is one that would be a positive thing for those who already have a tendency to domestic violence.
Oh yeah, that's another. We could have that discussion all day, or just, the prison system and incarceration in general in this country.
Why won't straight people get married as much anymore? There's an interesting article in the New York Times which said that of all the milestones on the road to adulthood, Americans are increasingly foregoing one of the biggest, which is marriage. 20% of adults older than 25 have never married, up from 9% in 1960. According to Pew Research Center report data, the trend has been consistent for decades. Since the 60s, we have seen each group of young adults less likely to marry and marrying to a lesser degree. This is so interesting to me, Lewis, because what have we seen over the last 10 years? The legalization of same-sex marriage. And if we look at the fact that nationally speaking, more and more gay couples are getting married because of the fact that it was previously illegal to do so in all states, we can attribute the decrease in marriage specifically to straight couples. And this is not at all to actually issue a critique of heterosexuality. This is more just we should remember that those who say that gay people being able to get married is going to cause some kind of a problem for marriage more broadly, it seems that the reasons for straight people not getting married have nothing to do with gay marriage at all, and mostly, Lewis, they're economic reasons.
And I think this is a great thing when you consider that over 50% of marriages end in divorce. Yes, let's not get married. And I think a lot of gay people are going to figure out that marriage
now
isn't
that
always
as they get the right to do it,
yeah,
they may opt not to. But of course, they absolutely should have the same right to do it that any couple does.
Of course, I've been saying for years, they deserve the right to be as miserable as everybody else.
So, of course, the economic reasons that seem to be connected to people choosing not to get married include people graduating from college with huge debts that it could take decades or even longer to pay off. Stagnant wages, or actually, we've seen a reduction in real wages if you consider inflation. If you consider the cost of marriage in conjunction with these debts and lack of income that people are having, it's no surprise at all that young adults would choose not to get married, aside, Lewis, from all of the objections that people could have to the institution of marriage conceptually.
Right, and we've got places in the world like in Japan where people are just forgoing relationships altogether.
Right.
It's an interesting time.
It certainly is. Lewis, at this point, you've said you're not interested in having children. If you accidentally had a kid, you'd probably love the kid. Where are you on marriage right now?
I'm okay with that.
You're okay with marriage?
I am. Yeah, I think that is fine if if that happens. If it's an opportunity that presents itself, I may in fact capitalize on that opportunity.
This is a big difference than what you've said in the past, is it not?
No, I was only talking about kids. I just strictly children. That was it. But I am open to marriage.
I'm stunned. And would you, let me ask in a different way. Are you recognizing that your partners are likely to desire marriage and you would kind of acquiesce? Or is marriage something you would be interested in and would seek out on your own? In other words, if your partner didn't want marriage, would that be a problem for you?
I think that I don't know. It depends on the situation, I guess. Yeah, I can't answer that. It would depend on the situation. It would depend on the person. I could understand in certain situations that person not wanting to get married for some of the reasons we just talked about. So I don't know.
I used to go to weddings of people my age or, whatever, around my age. And I would actually sometimes feel bad and I would say, geez, they're really getting into something that's bad here. More recently, though, I've gone to other weddings and I haven't felt that way. And I used to think that it was something about my view on marriage specifically. I'm now realizing I think I was just going to weddings where the people getting married probably shouldn't have been. And my reaction was not so much to the institution of marriage. It was more to, I don't know that this particular marriage is a good idea. And also, I've lately been going to more non-religious ceremonies, and I think that I view those far more positively than the 45 to 60-minute Catholic mass weddings. I think something about that just puts me in a mood where I feel like this is not a good idea.
I agree. Of the weddings I've been to that have been those brief non-religious ceremonies, I don't know. I think there's just something that feels better about them, but that just could be our own,
our own biases and preconceived notions.
It could be, yeah.
All right. Let's take a break. We have an excellent program planned for you today. We have great audience questions coming up, a great interview. We're going to review some stories. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Cutting-edge research shows that President Obama causes lightning, cats, and suicide. You can find more unbiased research like that at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is Thomas Ziccarelli. Thomas, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. We couldn't do this show. This show would probably be off the air or still at like once or twice a week if we did not have membership support. So please consider becoming a member. We're talking about the cost of one of those latte things once a month. Go to davidpakman.com/membership and remember that you can support us with the Amazon shopping that you do by going to davidpakman.com and clicking on the Amazon banner, bookmark the link, and then just click it before doing your shopping. Very, very easy. This week in show history, 4 years ago, Sarah Palin suggested that Christine O'Donnell speak through Fox News as opposed to through the lamestream media, and the absurd things we found out about Christine O'Donnell, the then Delaware Senate candidate, were expanding exponentially. 2010 was Christine O'Donnell's third run for office in 5 years, all three failed Senate attempts. Lewis was so convinced that she had no chance, despite what seemed like a growing fan base, that he actually agreed to dye his hair red if Christine O'Donnell won. She did not win, and one of O'Donnell's best blunders was claiming to have dabbled in witchcraft, which led to her putting an ad out that said she was not a witch. She also claimed that unnamed political opponents followed her around at all times, that American scientific companies were crossbreeding humans and animals and coming up with mice with fully functional human brains. A sort of mini Sarah Palin, don't you think, Lewis?
In a way, yeah, except her wacky ideas were less, wacky ideas and comments were less political and religious, although some were religious, and more just about overall nonsense.
Yeah, with Sarah Palin, they were mostly related to politics and political attacks, and they continue to be. Although Sarah Palin has dabbled in complete and utter non-political insanity as well. With Christine O'Donnell, it was just disjointed, disconnected rantings that were almost lunacy.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that if you need to put out a television ad campaign called "I'm Not a Witch," you're not going to win an election.
2 years ago this week, we had two very interesting things that happened on the program. I took, as well as Lewis and then TV director Natan, a psychopathy test, and we looked at the results. It turned out that I was the most psychopathic in the group by a pretty small margin. And really, Lewis, we all turned out to be very low on the psychopathy scale, which I don't know if it was surprising to us or not, but that's what it was.
Yeah, I guess we're all, level-headed individuals with empathy, and it's just, we're not psychopaths.
It was also just like an online multiple choice test, so I don't know how much importance we want to attach to it. And also 2 years ago, the three of us tried edible bugs, including grasshoppers and mixed bugs. We were kind of trying to test out what would it be like if society moved in the direction of animal protein coming from insects. And we ordered a bunch of different types of bugs. Lewis and Natan went all out. They had the grasshoppers, they had the worms. I don't even remember if Lewis pulled the wings off of the grasshopper before he ate it. I only took a very small bite, like a nibble, of a chocolate-covered silkworm, and then that was enough for me.
They were pretty disgusting, but these were just plain dried bugs, maybe with like a dash of salt thrown into the bag. I think if they're prepared correctly and cooked correctly or dried in a better way, they probably wouldn't be that bad. I mean, people all over the world eat bugs, since there are some very fancy restaurants that serve bugs. I'm sure there's a good way to do it.
I think that, at the time we said that if we went into the direction of animal protein coming from insects, that I'd be in trouble. I would probably just become a vegetarian if the only protein we could get was from crickets and, or rather animal protein was from crickets and silkworm larvae.
It might not be a bad move. It would certainly have less of a carbon footprint.
1 year ago this week, an anti-Obamacare ad featured a very creepy gynecological exam in an attempt to scare college students. This was one ad of many aimed at keeping young people away from enrolling in Obamacare and related exchanges. Let's take a look at that ad.
Oh, I see you chose to sign up for Obamacare.
Yeah, it's actually my first time here.
Well, here we are then. Change it to a gown, and the doctor will see you soon.
Okay, well, your vitals look good. Any changes in your diet or exercise? All right, can you swing on over, scoot on down, and try to make yourself comfortable? Okay, let's have a look.
It's really unfortunate that these types of ads and political attacks are aired unchallenged. And I recognize that the system we have allows for that, right? You're allowed to go and purchase an ad, purchase airtime. And if it's for a candidate, then there is kind of an equal time law. But if we're just talking about a political ad by a political action committee or sidebar group on an issue, there's no equal time, there's no opposition, and that's what it is. And studies have shown that in the case of Obamacare, the negative ads actually seem to have increased enrollment, or at least not had a definitive negative impact on enrollment, which is a good thing. Maybe some of these ads are so outlandish that it's hard for anybody to take them seriously.
I think that was probably one of them. It was just way too out there. And what they did was these ads seem to have just increased awareness about the program. And then once people go research the program, they find that, well, maybe this can help me.
Yeah, and regular political attack ads, candidate attack ads, are effective. We wouldn't see them constantly every election cycle if they weren't effective. Those really work. It's questionable, at least as far as on specific issue attack ads, whether they work or not may be related to some kind of more specific characteristics about the ad itself and the issue itself, which is a good thing. I mean, it would be great if people weren't so strongly influenced by any nonsense they see in a paid political advertisement.
Yeah, the ad we talked about here I think was just too over the top, but it was also about something that people really didn't know much about.
All right, let's take a break. We have an excellent program today. We have a great interview coming up. We will answer your audience questions. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Last week we told you the big news from NASA, which has provided some contracts to Boeing and SpaceX to create new spacecraft to shuttle NASA astronauts back and forth to the International Space Station. Since the shuttle program from NASA has been shut down, the US astronauts, the NASA astronauts, have been shuttled by a Russian spacecraft instead. So this was hugely exciting. And I thought for this week's classic interview, we would go back to 2011 when I interviewed Bob Werb from the Space Frontier Foundation. Now, not only was Bob a very interesting and quirky guy, as you'll soon see and hear, he also had some really interesting things to say about the future of space travel, where we should be focusing. And as I've said so many times, anyone who's been watching us or listening to us for any significant period of time knows that I put a lot of importance in expanding space travel, not only because at some point, particularly at the rate we're going with regard to climate change, humans may need to seek another home if we are to survive as a species, but also because I think that the unifying effect that real progress when it comes to space travel could have, not necessarily will have, but could have on relationships between countries and between races, etc. I think that it's also important for that reason. So we'll go back to June 28th, 2011. This is Bob Werb from the Space Frontier Foundation. I have so many questions for you, Bob. Thanks for talking to us.
Happy to do it.
I'm a bit of a space travel. I don't know that I would call myself a junkie, but I've read plenty of science fiction, and I probably have a lot of false ideas about what's possible and what's not. So I'll just get right into it. What's reasonable to expect in the next 5 to 10 years instead of space exploration and space travel?
Well, I actually want to answer a slightly different question, which is take a little bit longer term.
Okay.
Because the next 5 to 10 years are spectacularly muddled. And because there's just so much going on right now. And I think if we step back a little bit and look at, say, 20 years, we can have a lot more clarity in terms of understanding what's going on today. Because until just about 20 years ago from where we are now, human spaceflight was almost entirely about sending a few brave souls on military-style missions, these grand adventures of exploration. And the rest of us were supposed to stay home and watch on TV. And that began to change. And while I know that there are more than a few people who would like to go back to, relive the glory days of Apollo, that is simply not possible. I could spend an hour going over the numerous reasons why it just ain't gonna happen, but for the moment, just take my word for it. There's no going back.
So what is the way forward in your, is it planets? Is it just getting is it a colony on the moon? Is it a permanent, something permanent on a bigger space station?
Well, I think it's all of the above, and we need to really ask first, why is it we're doing it? And in my view, if America is going to have any human spaceflight at all 20 years from now, it's going to be almost entirely about using space for the benefit of everyone, rather than for grand adventures of exploration. And by that I mean we're going to open the space frontier in order to protect Earth's fragile environment. We're going to do it to protect human freedom and dignity, and we're going to do it to create prosperity. And in my view, if we don't do it for those reasons, we're just not going to do it at all. And right now, we are right at the middle of this transition, at the fork in the road. And these two very different goals are in really direct conflict. And you see a lot of that conflict in the public discussion about space.
Well, we see a lot of, we recently heard about further decreased funding for NASA. So it seems increasingly governments are less and less interested, would it be fair to say, in being involved in space exploration? Does that put the onus on private industry?
I think it's not that government is less interested, but that they're looking to get more value for the money. That they are not willing to fund these grand adventures, but they are willing to fund when they see real value for people here on Earth. And I think if we go out 20 years, when we look back, we'll say, oh, now it makes perfectly good sense. Because we're either going to have safe, reliable, affordable access to space, or we're going to have to go overseas to get into to get into orbit. 20 years from now, we're either going to have a vibrant new space economy that creates large numbers of new jobs, or we will have already lost today's existing government-funded jobs and we'll replace them with unemployment checks. And in short, I really think that we're either going to be opening the space frontier or we are going to be watching it happen in other countries while reminiscing about our past glories.
Do you expect the same time?
We make this decision now. We need to choose which way we want to go.
Do you expect the same type of this kind of patriotic, our country versus your country competition when it comes to space exploration going forward? It sounds like you don't think we've moved past that at all.
I think that many of us haven't moved past that. I certainly have. I see space more about economic development than about, showing off how good you are. And I think most people have moved past that point. I mean, not most people in Congress, but most people in the real world.
And what is the most exciting thing specifically that's on the horizon to you right now? I mean, that maybe most people don't even know about who are watching or listening to this. What has the most promise or you get the most excited about?
I think the most exciting thing is actually also the most important thing, which is getting into space affordably, reliably, and safely. You look back at the space shuttle, which is about to fly its last mission, and that thing costs billions of dollars every time you fly it, and there's roughly a 2% chance that you're going to kill everybody on board. Well, this might be appropriate for your grand adventures, in the military-style missions that we've been doing up till now. It's clearly not appropriate for any kind of sustainable economic development of the solar system. And we are now developing new vehicles to go into space along two completely different tracks. On the one hand, there are people using old technology. These would be companies like SpaceX and Orbital that are using, 40 and 50-year-old technology to build new rockets that do the same thing as our old rockets, but do them much more cheaply and more reliably. And at the same time, there's a group of people who are building suborbital rocket planes, basically pursuing the path we didn't pursue after the X-15, just to keep building airplanes that go higher and faster until you're all the way in orbit. And both of these are happening in parallel, and both of them offer enormous promise to let us get into space much cheaper and more reliably. The
suborbital flight possibilities. Talk a little bit about specifically what that could mean potentially for consumer airline travel. Is this a potential game changer? I mean, put some numbers behind it. What are we talking about here?
Oh, I mean, clearly flying suborbital intercontinental flight is the killer app. A lot more people want to go to the other side of the planet than want to go into space. And anybody who's ever sat on a 14-hour airplane flight would realize that if they could afford it, they'd pay almost anything to avoid that experience. But the technology is not quite there yet. The first generation of suborbital vehicles will be flying over the next couple of years, basically fly into space and come back to where they started from. They have very limited downrange capability. And there will probably be 2 more generations before we get to the point where we can actually fly halfway around the planet.
But what are we talking about in terms of speed? I mean, for some people who may not know, potentially we could get around to the other side of the world, and what are we talking? Instead of 14 hours, it might be...
Half hour, 45 minutes.
That's incredible.
It mostly depends on how it is you get to before you actually get into space. You're in space for 15, 20 minutes. And interestingly, once you can get to the other side of the planet, you pretty much can get to orbit. There's very little difference between the mission profile of getting to the other side of the planet and the mission profile of getting into low Earth orbit.
Remarkable. And, I have just so many questions, and we are short on time. The other thing a lot of people emailed me about, and they want for me to ask you is, are there practical applications to a base on the moon, or is that just kind of is it a pointless idea?
Well, we don't really know enough. There may be some things on the moon that are immensely valuable. It's our only known source of helium-3. Now, currently there's no market for helium-3, but if ever they get fusion reactors to work, they'll need a lot of helium-3, and the moon's the logical place to get it. It's also a possible location for building materials. But the asteroids compete perhaps favorably with going to the moon for building materials. We don't want to build things in space with bricks that we bring up from the Earth. We want to use bricks that we find in space. Just like you only bring, you didn't bring bricks from the old world to the new. We brought the tools to make the bricks.
Makes perfect sense. Well, this is fascinating stuff. Bob Werb, chairman of the Space Frontier Foundation. Thanks for joining us, and we'll definitely have you back. I know our audience will have plenty more questions for you.
I'd love to do it.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's Friday, and as you know, it's time to answer audience questions. Any questions you have, submit them to us. Go to davidpakman.com, click on Contact Us, and send us your question. Or leave us a voicemail for the Friday show, 219-2-DAVID-P. Molly wrote to me saying, David, should tipping be eliminated? Is it a custom that makes sense? I have very strong feelings about this, Lewis. I will first go to you, though. Should tipping be eliminated?
Sometimes I think it should, and sometimes I think it shouldn't. And keep in mind that I am someone who has been a bartender before and essentially a waiter. And I'm kind of torn on this. On one hand, I think that it sounds kind of ridiculous to ask patrons to add extra money to their bill because the restaurant is allowed to pay their waitress or waiter $2 an hour. To me, that really doesn't make much sense. And on the other hand, I know that there are plenty of places people are working at who are making $2 an hour, where if you factor in what they're making in tips, $30, $40, $50 an hour is what they're really making. And do I want to hurt those people by getting rid of this system? I don't know, but I'd be helping a lot of others.
This is my position, which is that we should absolutely get rid of tipping as a custom, is not designed because I think it's not designed to hurt those who are doing really well making money off tips. It is because it is a policy that makes no sense. As some of you may know, I was traveling through Europe recently, and in Europe, in many places, you don't tip anything at all. And if you tip, you leave the change up to the next dollar. If your bill was $10.20 and you put down $11, you might leave those 80 cents as the tip. In other places, if the service is really good, you might tip up to 5% as a kind of one-off thing. So if you go to a 20 or if you go to a $30 meal, you might leave a €30 meal, you might leave €1 or something like that, and that's it. And it was amazing because particularly with the exchange rate right now, Europe is quite expensive if you have dollars. But when I would look at prices at restaurants, I would remind myself, oh, wait a second. The prices I'm looking at, number one, include tax, which I don't know in the whole country, but at least in New York and in Massachusetts, tax is not included when you see $12 on the menu. But also, I don't need to add 15, 18, or even 20% for tip. So really, it's not actually that expensive. Now, why should we get rid of tipping here in the US? Number one, it really creates a worse experience for many people when there is a lack of clarity as to how much you should tip. Restaurants is pretty established. 18% is the norm, or is it 20, or was it 15? I don't know. It's getting pushed up in the direction of 20 for sure, but we more or less have an understanding of what it is. In many other places, Lewis, do you always tip the car valet if you park in a garage and every day you get your car out? or do you give them a holiday tip, or what is the right tipping situation there? If you go and you get a manicure, women tell me that you tip. Well, what if you get your hair cut as a man? Do you also tip there? Some people say yes. Other friends tell me they don't tip when they get a haircut. And particularly when you have tourists, how many people do you know, Lewis, who work in a tipped business and they say, the tourists show up and they don't tip because in their country there's no tipping? You're just asking for trouble. Pay a decent wage. If prices have to be slightly adjusted, do that and eliminate this horrible practice that leads both the customers who may not tip the right amount feeling guilty or embarrassed, and the employees often undercompensated.
And the problem is that if we were to eliminate tips right now as it stands in this country, it would just completely screw over so many service industry people because we know what would happen. They would be making minimum wage.
Right.
They would all of a sudden be making a lot less money. So I wouldn't do it right now. In a vacuum.
Nobody's suggesting doing it in a vacuum, right? But we should really be a culture that is more similar to what we had in all the different countries I visited in Europe, where at the most, some countries you might leave 5%, 6-7% for an incredibly great service that you received. You're not constantly tipping. You're not constantly dropping $1 here, $1 there. People make a decent living wage, and that is that. Next question came from Cal. Cal wants to know, when does poor diet cross the line into child abuse from the point of view of parents feeding their children a poor diet? This is not an easy question to answer, Lewis. We've talked many times about areas of the country where more fast food is consumed and it's just kind of part of the culture. We've talked, Lewis, about parents who only feed their kids some one unhealthy item. We've talked about parents who don't feed their children, and the children can sometimes be taken away for child abuse. When does simply feeding a poor diet, which as we've seen many times leads to horrible childhood obesity, when is it child abuse when the child should be taken away, as has happened?
That's a very tough question to answer. Certainly you can look at the weight of a child, and I think there definitely comes a point where you could say it's child abuse in that department.
But where would you set the line, right? And then some children are overweight not because of the diet, or not at least because of the diet alone, but maybe because of a medical condition or something else.
Right. And some children are fed crap nonstop and just don't gain weight because they have a fast metabolism. I know as growing up, my parents, they let me eat a lot of McDonald's, a lot of donuts, a lot of those disgusting frozen dinners. And, I can't believe they let me eat all that crap. But certainly, it's almost impossible to determine where you would draw these lines.
I think that this is a case where, as much as we like to do this, we can't really set a specific line. We have to say each situation needs to be analyzed individually, and many factors need to be taken into consideration, including in what other areas outside of just nutrition is the behavior of the parents either abusive or negligent? What other contributing factors may be connected to the child's obesity? As Lewis said, not all children from being fed poor diets will become obese because some may be just very physically active or otherwise have fast metabolisms. I am not at all comfortable putting together a specific list of what the barometer is, what the parameters are, where feeding your child a poor diet is child abuse.
I think we can both agree, though, when it comes to weight, there is a certain point at which you can say something is not right here. Perhaps this child needs to be with someone else.
There is no question about that. I just don't know exactly what that weight would be. And of course, we need to consider, and we're talking about weight as a percentage above what the normal weight would be given the child's size and age, certainly. We're not talking about just, if you're below 10, you should never weigh more than X amount of pounds. Obviously, that's absurd. Yeah, there are certainly some, at least broad parameters that could be put in place by experts. Very good question, tough one to answer. Last question today from Julia. Which right-wing media star would you want as co-host for your show? So, Lewis, if we were to bring in another co-host, a right-winger, to co-host with us on the program, is there anyone in particular that would be your top choice?
Well, media star. I mean, aren't all the stars kind of people we wouldn't want to have on the show.
Well,
I'm not
that's
sure.
the idea. Who would we choose if we had to pick someone from the right-wing media?
That's really difficult. Give me a minute. You answer this one.
I think it would probably be Glenn Beck if I had to think about it, because the combination of his delivery and his crazy ideas, I think, would make for the best kind of interaction. You know, Rush Limbaugh with his bizarre delivery. He says crazy stuff, but I don't know that the interplay. Let me put it this way. There's a reason why Rush Limbaugh has been doing his show essentially completely by himself in a room for decades, right? There's a reason for that. Sean Hannity, we saw how Sean Hannity interacted with a co-host when he was Hannity and Colmes, and that was not necessarily the most compelling television for many different reasons. And I think that somebody like Glenn Beck would be interesting. You know, we could say, oh, well, we would definitely bring on a woman at this point because we would want more gender diversity. I agree that that's probably what we would do if we were to hire someone, not just picking someone from right-wing media, right? I mean, certainly we would love to have a female voice on the program, but if I had to pick from right-wing media, it would probably be someone like Glenn Beck or maybe Ann Coulter.
See, I would disagree. I think they're just too crazy. I don't think they would fit. I think it would have to be someone more like Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity, someone who is at least somewhat grounded in reality, and who can discuss issues without just spewing complete insane nonsense.
No, maybe that's a good point. Maybe for this program, it's okay to have loons as guests for 8 to 12 minutes a couple of times a month, but maybe having that be a permanent co-host voice would be a little much, and someone who's a little more reasoned might make more sense. You may be convincing me, Louis. We'll see what people say about this. If you have any questions for us for the Friday show, anything goes, mostly. Go to davidpakman.com, click on Contact Us, write to us, or you can also leave us a voicemail. The voicemail number is 219-2DAVID-P. We will talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.